Who was Nero? Today, Emperor Nero is best remembered for allegedly starting the fire that burned down Rome, while allegedly fiddling, and for his persecution of the Christians. However, his life is far more strange and complex. Nero probably had mental issues and was corrupted by his absolute power. This led to his many evil deeds. We will see this by looking at, first, his rise to power, second, his sudden fall, and thirdly, his legacy. Nero rose to power as a young man, assisted by his mother's careful planning. This led to Rome's golden age. However, success went to his head and he began to indulge in increasingly erratic and dangerous behaviors. Nero was born in AD 37. He was Augustus Caesar's great-great-grandson. Nero wasn't initially supposed to be emperor, but his mother negotiated her way through the family hierarchy and eventually married her uncle Claudius, thus placing her son on the throne after she poisoned her new husband. Nero began to rule with the assistance of his mother and his tutor Seneca. The Quinquennium Neronis, or the first 5 years of Nero's reign, were remembered as the peak of Roman history. Nero worked to bring about a new Augustan age. He was working with the Senate to create many reforms which helped to improve the life of the working class. Trajan said, quote, "All other emperors fell behind Nero in his quinquennium," unquote. Nero was well loved by the people because he provided free entertainment and gave them free stuff. In fact, the theatrical nature of Nero's gift-giving became an important aspect of his reign. He really loved public speaking and became interested in theater. He even entered many competitions as he fell in love with the attention of the crowd. However, as his performances continued becoming increasingly frequent, the enthusiasm for his appearances began to wane. As a result, Nero began to force people to attend. He would send out invitations which were mandatory to accept. There were reports of women giving birth during performances because they couldn't leave, and also men leaping off the back wall of the theater in order to escape. He once had a party where he tried to convince his guests that he was a dog by dressing up in animal furs and running around biting people. After Nero killed his second wife, Pompeia, he was so filled with denial and guilt that he insisted that his young slave man was in fact Pompeia, and he made him dress up as her. And Nero lived with his servant as his wife for the rest of his life. Nero also began to dress up as a highwayman and went around robbing and murdering people at night. Of course, no one could protest to anything he did because he could just have them killed. Nero's mother became increasingly worried about her son's behavior, and she did her best to keep surveillance over him. Nero eventually decided to murder his mother, although he was haunted by this decision for the rest of his life. This marked the end of the Quinquennium Neronis. My second point is that Nero's strange behavior was increasingly matched by his lack of focus on imperial matters. As the empire fell into chaos, his opponents began to look for an opportunity to replace him. The first real threat to Nero's power came in 60 AD, when some Britons rebelled against the Romans, led by their queen Boudica, whom the Romans wouldn't allow her to rule because she was a woman. The Romans eventually prevailed, but for a while, Nero considered abandoning the province. In July 64 AD, a fire started at the Circus Maximus, raging for 6 days and destroying 10 of Rome's 14 districts. Nero claimed much land from the peoples whose houses and land had been burned up. He did this to create his huge, extravagant palace, the Domus Aurea. This led some to suspect that maybe he just started the fire in order to get the lands. Nero, in order to stop this rumor, blamed the Christians for the fire, who were generally looked at with suspicion because no one really knew what they did when they gathered together for church. Some charged them of cannibalism and incestuous relationships. Because of this, Nero arrested those who confessed to being Christians. As Tacitus said, quote, "A vast multitude were convicted, not so much on the charge of burning the city as of hating the human race," unquote. Nero would kill the Christians as if in sport, by setting wild dogs on them or burning them to serve as the evening lights. He would host large parties for people to come and watch the spectacle. Because of this, some Romans even began to feel compassion for the Christians. The Pisonian conspiracy was a plan in AD 65 to assassinate Nero and replace him with the statement Gaius Calpurnius Piso. However, it failed, but again, in 68 AD, Gaius Julius Vindex rebelled against Nero's tax policies. He was aided by Galba, who was the governor of Spain. Vindex declared himself the opposing emperor, but he was eventually defeated and committed suicide. However, his legions proclaimed Galba as their emperor, and the Praetorian Guard also abandoned Nero and came out in support of Galba, who would eventually become the next emperor. Nero wanted to flee the city, but his commanders refused to assist him. He decided to stay in the palace to decide what to do, but he woke up the next morning and found that his palace was empty, not even his bodyguards stayed. He decided to throw himself into the river Tiberias because suicide is pretty honorable, but he chickened out. My third point is that Nero's struggle with the Roman aristocracy and his ignominious death brought an end to the Julio-Claudian dynasty. This and his persecution made a permanent impact on his legacy. Nero and his only 4 remaining supporters donned peasant disguises and fled to a nearby villa. However, he was recognized when his horse spooked at a dead body. The company dug a secret entrance into the house. Nero resolved to kill himself again. He had his men dig a grave, because killing himself again is the honorable thing to do. However, he chickened out again after he was scared by the sharpness of his knife. Suddenly, he heard men riding up the pathway outside, fearing a dishonorable death. He said, quote, "What an artist the world is losing," unquote. Then he cut his throat and collapsed bleeding. He didn't do it very well, though, because it took a while for him to die. And the soldiers who had just arrived tried in vain to revive him, because they had actually come to say that the Senate had pardoned Nero. Because Nero was the last emperor in his dynasty and was succeeded by Galba, there was immense pressure on historians to depict his behavior negatively and as invalidating his claims to the throne. So basically, they had to try and convince people that it was a right that Nero was overthrown because it was probably a very bad thing that the dynasty had ended. Anyway, this is why many historians are so overwhelmingly negative in their accounts of Nero's reign. Although there was great public rejoicing at his death, strangely he was mourned intensely by the peasants and the lower classes, almost some treating him as a god. So there does appear that there might be another kind of narrative appearing around Nero's life. Some obviously didn't think he was so bad. In conclusion, Nero was a much more complex figure than he is typically remembered to be. He did have a successful reign at first, but he grew crazy, corrupted by his power, leading to his many evil deeds and actions. We can see this by looking at first his rise to power, secondly his fall from power, and thirdly his legacy. Thank you.